Hey everybody, Trey here. Welcome back to another video. What a day yesterday. That was an event that will be remembered for quite some time, as we had a pretty significant tornado outbreak from the Midwest, particularly down into the Mid-South across eastern Arkansas into northern Mississippi and southwest Tennessee yesterday afternoon into the nighttime hours. Definitely didn't quite go as I expected, as a lot of folks expected in the community. So my apologies for botching that forecast yesterday. Definitely wasn't sold initially on the threat for prefrontal convection, but sure enough, some supercells fired up just ahead of the ongoing line across eastern Arkansas into Tennessee, northern Mississippi, and absolutely got the job done with multiple significant tornadoes there, including the one near Lake City, Arkansas, which looked pretty significant. So my apologies there. It's going to be a really interesting event to dig into. Once I saw the satellite start to clear up and those temperatures, surface temperatures, get up into the mid 80s yesterday, I had a feeling that storms were going to pop off, and those questions about convective coverage ahead of the line were answered pretty quickly as multiple supercells developed. But that deep dive is going to have to wait for a few days, as we have more severe weather that is on the way today. This active pattern just will not quit. We have multiple days of quite elevated severe potential, starting with today, Thursday, April 3rd. The SPC has outlined an enhanced risk over a lot of the same areas that were impacted yesterday. Basically, the ArkLaTex area in through central to eastern Arkansas, northwest Mississippi into western Tennessee, basically Texarkana to Little Rock to Memphis to Jackson, all the way up toward Nashville, in that greatest level 3 out of 5 severe weather risk for today, with a broad level 2 out of 5 slight risk all the way up from the Baltimore, Washington, D.C. area all the way down into West Texas, as we have an expansive stalled frontal zone that is going to provide the impetus for severe weather today. All hazards on the table for today. 10% hashed area for tornadoes. This is somewhat conditional, but they do have a 10% hashed area for today for the threat for maybe a strong tornado or two in the yellow stippled region there within the enhanced risk. Again, Little Rock, Memphis, Jackson, Texarkana in that enhanced tornado risk for today, with a level 2, with a 2% and 5% surrounding that frontal zone there. Damaging wind also going to be a threat, as is large to very large hail. That may end up being one of the bigger threats today, as storms, a lot of the storms may have a tendency to be on the elevated side, which is optimal for hail production in the environment that we have. 30% hatched area for significant severe hail, perhaps hail in excess of 2, maybe 3 inches in diameter in the red stippled region there, as well as a few isolated large hail reports in the 15% hatched area as well. So that is today. Very similar setup tomorrow. SPC has an enhanced risk out as well, level 3 out of 5 from the ArkLaTex, once again into southeast Oklahoma, now into more of central and northern Arkansas and far southern Missouri, places like Texarkana, toward Little Rock, up toward Jonesboro, far southern Missouri there in the level 3 out of 5 risk, with a level 2 out of 5 slight risk surrounding that. Very similar hazards tomorrow. 10% hatched risk for tornadoes. That threat might be a little bit less conditional. We'll talk about that in just a second. But 10% hatched area for some strong tornado potential from southeast Oklahoma, northeast Texas, up through Arkansas and southern Missouri. Also with a damaging wind and large to very large hail threat there. So that is tomorrow for Friday. Day 3, we also have an enhanced risk out centered on Louisiana. Far east Texas, much of the northern 3/4 of Louisiana or so, southern Arkansas, western Mississippi, a lot of the same areas that have seen significant severe weather over the past several days are under the gun once again here for Saturday, which could be potentially a significant event. 30% hatched area for significant severe weather there in that enhanced risk region. And then the risk shifts on to the east across the southeast going into day 4, which is Sunday. And then hopefully we will get a few days to catch our breaths here after this very active stretch to start off the first half of spring. Before we move on to the severe threat, I wanted to bring your attention to the flash flooding risk. The risk for excessive rainfall is pretty much maximized across some of these same corridors. Basically, the ArkLaTex northeastward into the Ohio River Valley, with a high risk today, level 4 out of 4 from the WPC, from eastern Arkansas through western Tennessee, the Missouri boot heel up into western Kentucky, for the threat of significant excessive rainfall and life-threatening, perhaps catastrophic flash flooding. This is day 2. Tomorrow, Friday, moderate risk, level 3 out of 4 there in some of those same areas. And then we have another high risk centered on that Mississippi River, Ohio River confluence area Northeast Arkansas, Western Tennessee, and Kentucky there for the Saturday timeframe into Sunday morning. High risk, level 4 out of 4 there, and then we kind of trail things off into into the late part of the weekend and early next week. But these next 3 days going to be significant flash flooding and excessive rainfall, as again we just have a stalled front across this region that is going to allow for multiple rounds of convection to train across the same areas, producing a lot of rainfall. Here's the QPF forecast, the quantitative precipitation forecast for the next 3 days, highlighting 15 plus inches in the yellow regions here, right in that corridor from Arkansas into western Tennessee and Kentucky. So that could be very catastrophic, life-threatening rainfall and flash flooding for low-lying areas, especially in that region. So make your preparations accordingly. Have a spot where you can get to higher ground at a moment's notice, and we'll have to see how things play out in the flash flooding arena for these next few days. But moving on to the severe side, let's start off with what's going on right now. I'm recording this just before 10 a.m. Central Daylight Time, and we've already had quite a bit of convection left over from last night persist into this morning. Quite a bit of convection from Oklahoma in through areas off to the east, Arkansas, Tennessee, and Kentucky, even farther off to the east. Lots of rainfall already has fallen on these areas, and more will be on the way. A couple isolated severe reports here this morning, possibly within some of these stronger cores, but mostly just elevated low-end convection, low-end severe convection at best, and that will continue through the morning hours. What we're watching is the area to the south of this activity along the frontal zone, and anything to the south of the frontal zone that can develop. We'll take a look at the surface map here in just a second to show you where that frontal zone is setting up. But most of these storms right now to the north of that front, they are elevated. We're watching for any development. A lot of development probably will continue to the north of the front going through the day, but anything along and to the south of that front will have the potential to produce that all-hazard threat, including the threat for significant tornadoes. All right, 500 millibar map. Here is what we have going on right now at 14Z. So here is kind of our pattern now. Here's our shortwave from yesterday. Very potent jet streak has moved off into the Great Lakes region, not of impact to us today. That will continue to move off to the northeast and get out of our hair here. And then we're just going to be left within this broad southwesterly flow regime across parts of the southern plains into the mid-south and southeast. And you can even notice a little bit of ridging perhaps over these central and southern plains here. That is going to be in place for today. So the background forcing for ascent ahead of this next trough you see back in here, between that trough and our jet streak that is moving off to the northeast, we're just going to be kind of in this neutral forcing regime, some neutral heights to almost height rises. We usually talk about height falls when we're predicting for severe weather, which is when these height contours move kind of across an area, which means lower heights moving into a region of interest. That's not going to be the case today. These height contours are going to stay pretty much as they are right now, even start to move off to the north a little bit in what we call height rises, which do not tend to promote upward motion like height falls do. So overall, the synoptic scale forcing for ascent is going to be quite weak today. But so this frontal zone and any heating and warm, moist advection that occurs is going to be our main focus, main driving mechanism for severe weather today. Here is our surface map right now, and you can see kind of where that frontal zone is. A little bit of a pressure tongue in the isobars right in here. That is where our front is sitting right now. And we'll take a look at the actual surface obs in just a second. But here's our surface low well up into Canada, occluded low, no question about it here with kind of that. And then we have our cold front that's just draped kind of down here off into the central and southern plains. As you can see, most of this convection that's ongoing this morning north of that frontal boundary, so it is elevated. But this front may sag north a little bit with continued warm, moist advection to its south. You see those southerly winds to its south. Might continue to push that front off to the north ever so slightly, but mostly it's going to just kind of sit here through tomorrow and through the next several days as well, and that front is going to be a focus. Number one, as that warm advection overruns the front, we're going to get forcing on the north side of that front to initiate more elevated convection with a large to very large hail threat. But any storms that can fire and latch onto the frontal zone here or stay in the warm sector to the south will have that greatest threat for significant tornadoes. And the front, as you see here, is kind of oriented pretty well compared to the mid and upper level flow. So storm motion should be pretty much parallel to the front. So any storm that can fire near the front and latch onto it could have perhaps a long track tornado risk if it can anchor to the front. What is key in these scenarios is the overall temperature gradient across the front. That can really define whether or not a front is favorable for that latching, that supercell latching and significant long track tornado production. Let's take a look at our surface observations here. So let's take a look and try to pinpoint where our front is right now. So you see the wind shift here across parts of North Texas. Winds are out of the north or northeast across Arkansas as well, up into Tennessee, more easterly flow, with southerly winds to the south of that across Louisiana, Mississippi, East Texas. So clear wind shift here, clear temperature gradient. Those temperatures in the 70s and 80s down here to the south, temperatures in the 50s and 60s off to the north. So very clear temperature gradient here. So I'm going to draw in our frontal zone somewhere right in this vicinity here, it looks like, and it continues to trail off to the north up into western Tennessee. So there is our frontal zone right now. And that's, of course, stretches off to the east as well. We'll focus perhaps the continued severe threat off to the east of this particular domain in that level 2 out of 5 slight risk area. But for our level 3 out of 5 enhanced risk area for today, this front, again, not going to do much moving at all. It might inch to the north just a tad, given strong warm advection to its south, slightly stronger surface winds off to the south as well of this frontal zone, 15 knots or so, might push that off to the north ever so slightly. But overall, not going to do much movement. And that is going to really add to our heavy rain threat as well, with lots of training convection along this frontal zone. And then lots of severe convection, both again on the north side as warm advection kind of overruns that frontal zone. So lots of storms on the north side and some convection possibly on the south side of the front. That is the conditional part of today's setup. Will we get convection to develop and be able to impinge upon the warm, moist sector here to the south, near and to the south of that frontal zone? That is the question for today, and it's still kind of a big if. Without synoptic scale forcing for ascent as well, that frontal zone going to be the major factor in initiating storms today. So open warm sector convection itself may be hard to come by, just given the overall nebulous forcing for ascent. So that frontal zone, I think most of the storms going to be north of that frontal zone and kind of close to that frontal zone there. So that southern portion of that oval is going to be the area to watch right along that frontal zone to watch for significant severe convection. The air mass to the south of the front is quite juicy. Temperatures already in the mid to upper 70s and low 80s, with dew points in the low 70s across this broad region from the southeast into the East Texas vicinity. So that air mass very juicy to the south of that frontal zone to help any storms out that can impinge upon the warm sector. Here is our morning Shreveport sounding, 12Z sounding at Shreveport, Louisiana, just south of the front, and you can see a very favorable environment for severe weather already in place. Very deep moisture, 75 over 73 at the surface, with deep moisture extending up to about 800 millibars or so. So plenty of juice in the low levels for these storms to work with. Strong instability elevated above this capping inversion that's in place. Somewhat of a weak capping inversion at that. Would expect that to erode with continued surface heating going through the day, although we don't really have much of a forcing mechanism to really lift and cool this cap. So that may be somewhat of a question we have to watch for later on in the afternoon. Will we have enough cap erosion, given minimal forcing for ascent on the synoptic scale, to erode this cap? Through surface heating, if temperatures get up into the 80s, probably not going to be too much of an issue, but we may still have a little bit of a warm nose to contend with, which may also suppress warm sector convection even as the low levels warm and moisten. That may be a little bit of a bugaboo in this setup for warm sector convection, and therefore that stronger convergence along the frontal zone and north of the frontal zone may help things out in that regard to push those storms through that any lingering capping inversion that exists. Kinematically, we are in a very impressive regime here with strong deep layer shear, effective bulk shear over 60 knots, long photographs, and already impressive low-level shear. And that, with not much change in the low-level pattern, not expected to change much itself through the day today. Very strong curvature in the low levels there. Strong veering and strengthening of the winds with height, about 340 meters square per second squared, effective storm relative helicity, with a strong low-level jet in place. So all in all, the environment is already pretty primed for severe weather. We just need to get initiation, and if any storms can tap into that warm sector along and south of the front, this air mass, and of course, as we know, the frontal zones, these boundaries can house even stronger low-level shear than this. So this environment certainly favorable for severe weather for any storms that can tap into the air mass along to the south of the frontal zone. All right, here is the NAM for today, and this is at 500 millibars, 12Z NAM, and just keep your eye on the height contours here and just kind of this broad southwesterly flow regime in between these two troughs. You see not much change at all, even some slight height rises here through the day across these areas, so not a ton of forcing on the synoptic scale at all in this setup. If we look at 250 millibars, we're not seeing much defluence as well, just kind of broad southwesterly flow across this region. So we're at the mercy of the frontal zone and warm advection to initiate storms in likely that zone of convergence close to the frontal zone itself. And if any confluence bands do form in the open warm sector, they could fire some supercells there. But the problem is with such weak synoptic scale forcing, will they be able to sustain themselves? That's why the frontal zone and the area to the north of the front are the favored corridors for severe storms today. So overall, very weak synoptic scale forcing for ascent ahead of this second trough. We'll talk about that more in just a little bit as we get into tomorrow's threat. But we're just kind of in this broad southwesterly flow regime for much of the day today. Here is our surface pattern. I'm just going to skip right to the dew point here, as that's going to give us a much clearer picture of where that frontal zone is. So you see the wind shift, or the moisture gradient there, very tight moisture gradient across these areas. That front maybe inches off to the north ever so slightly during the day, and then just kind of sits there and stalls across the ArkLaTex into southern Arkansas, into Tennessee there. And you see a very strong moisture gradient. Let's see the temperature gradient across it. And this is a little bit of interest here. I don't usually like boundaries that have such strong temperature gradients across them. You usually want a more diffuse temperature gradient across these boundaries, as these sharp boundaries can really, storms can easily move off to the cold side, produce outflow that shunts the boundary southward. And we'll also have to keep in mind that any convection to the north of the front may just reinforce where that frontal zone is. Could be a little bit farther south than expected. This is just one model run, but overall, the NAM has it right here, but very strong temperature gradient across it. Not in love with boundaries that look like that, but overall, with the front expected to really just stay in place given minimal synoptic forcing, shouldn't be too much of an issue, but it is something to watch here. Very moist air to the south of the frontal zone. Here's dew points in the moisten even further going into the day. Today, dew points in the low to mid 70s down here south of the frontal zone. So let's take a few soundings here. We'll take one in the ArkLaTex there, and then we'll take one there in southern Arkansas, close to the warm front. So here's our environment south of the front in the ArkLaTex. Slightly weaker low-level shear back in here. Strong deep layer shear, 50+ knots of effective bulk shear, but weak low-level shear with large instability, 4,300 joules per kilogram mixed layer cape across with the NAM here. Just want to check real quick the visible satellite imagery. We're already starting to see some clearing to the south of the frontal zone, so that could foster some pretty robust instability across these areas. The NAM may be a little bit overdone here, but overall robust instability as those temperatures get up into the probably upper 80s, I would suspect. Maybe even approaching 90 down there, which would lead to robust instability. A little bit of this warm nose remains, which is not all that surprising since we don't have forcing to lift and cool that capping inversion. But we are at least fully destabilized, it looks like, but this warm nose may thwart updraft intensity to the south of the front and allow storms to struggle down there with such limited forcing. So this would certainly be more of a large hail and damaging wind profile here, farther to the southwest. Given large instability, strong instability around that around and above that freezing level, which is right here. You see that instability around and above that level to support hail growth, and then minimal low-level shear with strong deep layer shear in a supercell mode would favor large to very large hail. Here we go into Arkansas, and this is why the significant tornado threat is quite a bit higher off to the northeast. We are more so in that low-level jet core. I'll show you the 850 millibar map here as we go through the day. Slightly stronger flow. Starts out in East Texas and then kind of shifts off to the northeast with time here, centered there up into the Arkansas, West Tennessee vicinity. So that's where your much stronger low-level flow is, leading to stronger low-level shear, some varying and strengthening of those winds with height, strong, large looping hodographs, 400+ meters squared per second squared effective storm relative helicity there. So that this environment across southern Arkansas into western Tennessee would certainly favor more of your significant tornado risk. But again, that is conditional on if storms can actually latch onto the frontal boundary or fire in the warm sector just to the south of the boundary. But very strong instability, 4,600 joules per kilogram. That's pretty pretty darn high for early April. That's probably overestimated a little bit, but still, you knock that down a little bit into the 3,000 range. That's still very strong instability, strong low-level instability as well, 200 plus joules per kilogram, 0 to 3 kilometer cape. So the thermodynamic profile in this setup looks pretty darn good. Once again, very favorable for large hail, but with more stronger low-level shear, that certainly would favor a tornado risk, perhaps a strong tornado risk, if storms can get into that warm sector there. So let's take a look at some cams here for today. That's going to be really all there is to talk about today. It's going to be focused along that frontal zone. Here is the 12Z HRR. You see all that convection to the north of the front, and then you see additional development there. Kind of gets more robust to the north of the front here going into the afternoon, and I will just show you here. This is going to be 19Z, so this is 2 p.m. So take a look at where all that convection is right there, northeast Texas into central Arkansas, western Tennessee, northern Mississippi, and we'll compare it to where the frontal zone is. So you can see a lot of that is just along and to the north of that stalled front. So I think most of that will tend to be elevated convection here, but if we draw on our front, we do see some attempts, perhaps back here to the southwest a little bit, far into the ArkLaTex, southwest Arkansas, and maybe up here into the northern Mississippi, where some updrafts are along or just to the south of the front. Again, most of this is on the north side of the front, so it will be elevated convection, producing that significant hail risk. But the HRR does have a few storms here along and south of the frontal zone, those would have the best chances of producing that all hazards risk. And those kind of persist there, very close to that frontal zone. So those will need to be watched extremely closely going into the afternoon hours. And then we should see that kind of convection just kind of train over the same areas, perhaps some additional development later on into East Texas, as the HRR shows here. And that could pose that all hazards risk as well. Let's take a look at the ARW. ARW model has some decent convection there. This is at 20Z, so 3 p.m. Let's take a look. This is going to be hour 8. And so here is our frontal zone location on the ARW. Right in there. And let's pop up our reflectivity once again at this hour. So there you go. Both of these models now kind of depicting some of that convection on the southwestern flank of that convective mass may try to get along or just south of the frontal zone. And again, those would need to be watched most closely, with most of the other activity more elevated north of the frontal zone. But this activity back here from the ArkLaTex northeastward will be very close to that frontal zone, and perhaps some activity here in northern Mississippi as well, just south of the front, that needs to be watched right along this corridor. So the overarching threat for today is that most of the activity should remain elevated, mostly a large hail risk with that across mostly Arkansas, with some potential for a supercell or two to get into that warm air mass along into the south of the front to produce that significant all hazards threat. So that is today. Let's go into tomorrow. I'm going to go back to the NAM here, zooming out for us. We'll go back to 500 millibars. So here we go into tomorrow's threat, and you'll see that this trough starts to impinge upon the southern plains a little bit more as we go into the day tomorrow. And you see a little bit of a short wave perhaps developing in the eastern side of that trough. Just a little bit of a short wave perhaps kind of starting to impinge upon the southern plains. But still, we're mostly within this just broad southwesterly flow regime with not a ton of synoptic scale forcing for ascent, even a little bit of ridging. You recall that the enhanced risk is up in here, southeast Oklahoma into Arkansas. Just a little bit of ridging here over this area, as we're still a little bit removed from the actual shortwave that is developing out across these areas. So that will be more of a play for Saturday, but Friday, a very similar setup to today, with somewhat limited synoptic scale forcing for ascent across those areas, relying on that frontal zone and warm, moist advection to get the job done. So let's take a look at where that frontal zone is. So you see here, as we go into the day tomorrow, that frontal zone does lift north a little bit. These models actually have perhaps a little bit of a surface low that develops along the front there in northeast Texas. You see a little bit of a swirl in the winds there out across that area. So perhaps a little bit of a frontal low pressure area that's developing, which will help to push that frontal zone off to the north a little bit into areas that a little bit farther north than what we saw today. You see the reds there, those are the temperatures there, the warmer temperatures in the 70s and 80s. That front lifts all the way up into northern Arkansas and southeast Oklahoma by tomorrow, and up perhaps into the Missouri boot heel. So areas off to the north compared to today will see a greater risk for severe storms. And with that warm sector moving north with time, any convection that fires near or just north of the front may actually end up moving into the warm sector a little bit, going into the afternoon and evening on Friday. So here is our moisture. We maintain a very moist air mass going into tomorrow to the south of the front. And so let's take a look at some soundings here tomorrow afternoon. ArkLaTex into central Arkansas. We'll take one just west of Little Rock there. And this looks pretty darn favorable for significant severe weather. 21Z on Friday here at, let's see, this was the ArkLaTex region. With a little bit of that secondary surface low development, the low-level flow will be a little bit stronger across these areas than it is today. You see that jet core there, 50 knots or so, some splotches of 50 there from in the ArkLaTex region into southeast Oklahoma. And that is leading to some strong kinematics with some pretty decent thermodynamics as well. 2,700 joules per kilogram mixed layer cape, fairly strong instability going up through the profile, fully uncapped, moist, low-level air mass with this kind of a wind profile, strong deep layer shear, strong low-level shear, strong veering and strengthening of those winds with height, 300 plus meters square per second squared effective storm relative helicity. Assuming we can get supercells in the warm sector, which we should, as that warm sector expands off to the north, that would favor that all hazards risk, including significant tornadoes. Up here to the north, a little bit weaker low-level shear, but still more than adequate for tornadoes there. Decent instability, 2,700 joules per kilogram mixed layer cape, so a fairly homogeneous atmosphere across the entire warm sector as it lifts north. And so we should be able to sustain with warm advection, focusing along the frontal zones. We should be able to get storms to develop with ample heating in the warm sector as well, with temperatures up into the 80s tomorrow. Should be able to get convection, perhaps confined closer to the frontal zones there, the warm front and the dry line back to the west. But we still should get some storms there, and perhaps any warm advection, little confluence bands in the warm sector may need to be watched as well. Question, though, of course, is that synoptic scale forcing for ascent is on the weaker side, but a little bit broader warm sector and a little bit better ability for storms to be in the warm sector tomorrow will lead to that strong tornado risk there from the ArkLaTex into southeast Oklahoma into much of Arkansas. So that is tomorrow. Let's just take a look at the cams real quick for tomorrow. I just want to give you an idea of what the morning HRRR has for tomorrow. Again, take this with a grain of salt. We know what the cams don't do great more than a few hours out from an event, but this is just to show you. You see there overnight going into tomorrow morning, some elevated storms north of the front that could produce significant severe hail there, and that is going to be overnight tonight, 3, 4, 5, 6 a.m. into the morning tomorrow. And then you see we go into tomorrow and we get quite a few bands of supercells here out in the warm sector, kind of near those frontal zones. And you see multiple robust supercells all the way down into East Texas, but up here into the ArkLaTex, southeast Oklahoma, up into northern Arkansas. In that broader warm sector, those would pose that all hazards risk for significant severe weather. And then things kind of congeal into more of a line. You see all this convection just training across these areas where the flash flooding risk is. And then for Saturday, lots of rainfall to the north of the front as we get a little bit more forcing to come in. And with that, let's go ahead and talk about Saturday real quick. So Saturday, once again, enhanced risk down in the kind of centered on Louisiana, southern Arkansas, Mississippi. We will back things out here to 500 millibars. So here we go from Friday evening going forward. You see that trough finally starts to make its push into the southern U.S. We get a little bit of a shortwave to develop out across these areas. You see this shortwave associated jet streak moving into Texas there by Saturday afternoon, which would put the exit region kind of right in here, a little bit farther west perhaps than what the SPC has, but the moisture is a little bit off to the east. Just from my initial look at things here, the jet streak with this one does not appear to be moving all that fast compared to an event like yesterday or, say, the mid-March event, March 14th and 15th. That jet streak was moving very fast. It covered a lot of space in just a several-hour time frame. This one is kind of just slowly meandering, not moving a ton, and perhaps it's a little bit farther west compared to our area of interest. You see our moisture is more so in this vicinity here, whereas the short waves kind of back off to the west ever so slightly. We should still have enough forcing over the warm sector, but perhaps not quite as confident in a truly robust event across these areas for Saturday, given the jet translation speed. Maybe just at first glance a little bit on the slower side, perhaps. But still, it's probably going to be close, and I wouldn't, I'm just doing this as an eyeball kind of thing. But we probably will have enough forcing for severe weather, perhaps in multiple rounds on Saturday. We should see surface low development as well as this trough moves in. You see our warm sector extends all the way up into the Midwest there. And then we do see surface low development mostly late Saturday, kind of along the triple point there, where the stalled frontal zone and the dry line kind of meet. We get secondary surface low development out in there, and then that kind of moves along the frontal zone going into Sunday, where our threat shifts off into the southeast. Overall, though, fairly broad warm sector depicted by the NAM here for Saturday. Lots of real estate for severe storms to occur. You see our main boundary back in here, dry line / frontal zone, whatever you want to call it, stalled front right in here, kind of triple point right in there. Fairly broad warm sector here extending from East Texas all the way into perhaps Alabama, where the instability resides. And so let's take a look here, sounding across northwest Louisiana, just to give you an idea of what the environment might look like here. With that secondary surface low development, we should see fairly strong low-level wind fields, and that's certainly what we see at the 850 millibar level. Low-level jet is kind of maximized across this corridor during the day. So here you go. Instability a little bit on the skinny side here, so that could be due to some cloud cover, very saturated low-level air mass as well. So not the optimal thermodynamic profile for a big southeast event, but still plenty of instability, 1,700 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE. It is a little bit on the skinny side, as we said, a little bit of a saturated low-level and mid-level atmosphere. But our wind profile certainly would favor significant severe weather, strong deep layer shear, 50-plus knots of effective bulk shear, with strong low-level shear, veering and strengthening of those winds with height. 300-plus meters squared per second squared effective SRH would foster that all hazards risk, including the threat for tornadoes. Still, some details need to be worked out, but the environment certainly does look favorable for that all hazards threat on Saturday, damaging wind and tornadoes especially, if storms can become robust. Again, we'll have to wait and see how the storm mode kind of reacts, and if we get, if that jet streak is favorably positioned. But overall, here are our initiating boundaries. Here, that front back to the west, we'll see deep layer shear vectors do look kind of parallel to that boundary back to the west, so that could lead to a more messy mode along the actual front there. But of course, with such a broad warm sector, any confluence bands in the open warm sector would have to be watched closely for supercell production that could foster that all hazards threat. Just a quick look at the GFS here to see if it's on the same page. So here we are on Saturday, and you see the trough is just kind of meandering here across the southern plains, not really a super fast-moving jet here once again, but we do have that stronger flow starting to impinge upon that southeast region. Some defluence aloft, certainly some defluence aloft starting to overspread this region as well. So we should have plenty of synoptic scale forcing for ascent to warrant a robust severe weather event. You see the winds over the southern plains out of the south with more west-southwesterly flow there over the Gulf Coast. So ample defluence aloft overspreading the region there on Saturday to support ample forcing for ascent. GFS here with the warm sector, once again a fairly broad warm sector, and that, let's see the GFS profiles there in northern Louisiana once again, 4 p.m. Saturday. Yeah, there you go. That would favor an all hazards threat for sure. Instability about 2,100 joules per kilogram, a little bit more robust instability than the NAM was showing, but somewhat saturated low levels. Always something to watch there in the southeast. Not always the most favorable for a real robust event. You'd like to see a little bit more dry air there in the mid levels to promote more of a subtle cap through the day and some more conditional instability and more visible photogenic storms at that. But plenty of instability to support a severe threat, 2,100 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE with robust low-level shear as well, turning and strengthening of those winds with height, 250 meters squared per second squared effective SRH would favor that all-hazard threat, including a threat for tornadic activity. So that's going to wrap things up for this video. I'll be back as needed with additional updates as we get some more data in over the coming days if the setups warrant. But for today, once again, enhanced risk along that corridor near the frontal zone from the ArkLaTex northeastward through Arkansas into western Tennessee. Strong tornado risk is a bit conditional, but our models do show that some of those storms, particularly on the southwestern flank of the convection, may have a tendency to be along and just to the south of the front to support surface-based storms with that significant tornado risk. But most of the convection should be relegated to the north side of the frontal zone, which would foster more of a large to very large hail threat given the robust instability at play. And then even overnight, we could see some storms fire up there in north central to central Texas, southern Oklahoma, with that significant hail threat, as they will be elevated north of the front. Damaging winds going to be a risk as well. Tomorrow, the surface-based supercell threat in the warm sector looks a little bit better, given that our warm sector will be lifting north with time and is quite broad. Enhanced risk, once again, level 3 out of 5 from the ArkLaTex into southeast Oklahoma, much of Arkansas and far southern Missouri. Tornado risk, strong tornado risk does exist. Likely will be convection mostly confined to the frontal zones given weak synoptic forcing for ascent. So that dry line to the west, the frontal zone, stalled front off to the north and northeast there. Convection will be tied close to those areas with a threat initially with supercells for that all hazards risk, including significant tornadoes before things kind of line out and into more of a damaging wind producing clustered mode to MCS type mode. A large hail threat as well initially with those supercells. And then Saturday, enhanced risk across the eastern Texas corridor to Louisiana, southern Arkansas, western Mississippi. All hazards will be on the table for that event with a pretty good agreement for this range. Significant severe weather is possible with multiple rounds of severe storms near the frontal zones and the dry line back to the west, and perhaps any open warm sector convection there would pose a risk for all severe hazards, perhaps significant. So with that, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.